Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion on astrology, art, and adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore the current planetary alignments and offer insights for coping with change. Educational, informative, enlightening, the Turning of the Wheel is a welcome pause in your daily swirl of constant change. Through intelligent discourse, inspired guests, and educational segments, I will help to enlighten your knowledge of astrology and guide you to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Call in with your questions and speak with some of the greatest visionaries in the time-tested practice of astrology. Turning of the Wheel, Astrology, Art, and Adventure with Chris Flisher, each week on Turning of the Wheel podcast. Hello, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flisher, and as you know, this is a show about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. And I'm on a true adventure today. I'm in the wilds of Canterbury, England, of all places, speaking with the inestimable Geoffrey Cornelius, who's going to be my guest today. We're going to be talking about his book, The Moment of Astrology, and his take of astrology. It's a great honor to be out here and to speak with him in person in this wonderful area of the world, and to sort of elevate the conversation to a place where we understand astrology from a different viewpoint and bring it to a level where we can really begin to appreciate its value as a divination tool to all of us in the world, and also to help us get to a spot where we feel comfortable with the symbology and what it can provide for us. There's a great deal of depth in astrology, as you know. You've heard me speak about this for ages on the radio show. And the more information we have, the better we are informed. And the better we are informed, the better we can shape our lives in a very positive way, which is really my goal at the end of the day, is to make our lives positive in some way. And the more information we have, the better we are. So, Geoffrey, thank you so much for coming on today. I certainly appreciate it. It's been great to come out here and see you and in person, which is rare for me to be able to do that. But I do want to give you some introduction first, if I could. Geoffrey is a consultant astrologer with a background in philosophy and divination. He has majored in religious studies, and he's the former president of the Astrological Lodge of London and a co-founder of the Company of Astrologers. He has been active in the United Kingdom astrological education since the early 1970s and is one of the original band of pioneers on the subject of both in adult education and at the university level. He currently teaches cosmology and divination in the Mysticism and Religious Experience program at the University of Kent, where he is engaged in postgraduate studies in divination. So we're obviously talking with a very intelligent man here about a very complicated topic, and it's a great honor to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Chris. It's really good that you've come to see me. So hope we can throw some light on the on the subject matter. So your book, The Moment of Astrology, is an interesting book. I've read quite a bit of it. I have to say I haven't read it all, but I've been through it quite a bit, and I'm always been curious about, because much of astrology is based on time and place, as we know, and I'm wondering why you chose the title of The Moment of Astrology and how that sort of spins out. Yes, it's an interesting title, isn't it? I'm really making a statement, I suppose, based on my understanding of astrology, that we should look at the moment that an understanding arises. The moment astrology shows itself is the moment I'm interested in. So I think there's some magic about the way symbols come to life. And the astrologer and the client together bring symbols to life. So that's the moment that interests me. Mm-hmm. And that gets away from over-relying too much on an idea that everything is predetermined at birth, where you say, well, whatever is the truth of fate, which is a great mystery to all of humankind, what really matters is the moment that a narrative is born and symbols have come to life and shown themselves to us, because they've then got something to teach us, and that's the moment that counts. So the title refers to that idea.
So do you think that during an astrology consultation that there is just that thing, there's a moment of recognition where the symbols do in fact come to light through the eyes of the astrologer, or is that based on the person engaged in the astrology?
It's a dialogue process, really, because it depends on both parties working together to make this happen. Mm-hmm. So the astrologer isn't, in my view, a pure knower all on their own, isolated. They're bringing to light something that the person coming wants to hear brought to light, and there's some something at work, who knows what, in the unconscious, at the spirit level, whatever it is that draws people together. And that drawing people together draws the client together to the astrologer, and the astrologer commits themselves to a certain task as honestly as they can, and in that act, often they don't know why they've said exactly what they've said, but they'll begin to open up something that's truthful, and truth becomes revealed in this act. So it's a marvellous ritual of symbolism that we practice, and it has tremendous revelatory potential for an individual. They can see their life in a different way, and that at the same time is a healing potential, and this is one of the great gifts of astrology to my mind.
So it's a very spontaneous interchange based on time and place of two people coming together, and that sort of chemistry, that magical sort of interchange is what is revealing.
Yes, it's the interchange is revealing, and that's made by us and the spirits that are in us. That's what makes it. It isn't that the heavens are making this. We are shown things by the heavens, but it's up to us to take the responsibility of knowing and seeing and doing and acting.
And much of that depends upon the individual who wants the astrology chart to be done to take that initiatory step.
Yes.
So they are actively engaged in the conversation. They have to, because they're looking for information on their own. And when they are actively engaged by seeking out you as an astrologer, say, for example, they have already taken half the steps by entering into the conversation.
It's a serious process. So when I say serious, I'm a Saturnine person, so I can all make this too heavy duty, because there's also a wonderful playful and light quality to it. But nevertheless, it is a commitment by somebody to enter a process with another human being on both sides. So the old astrologers, like Benatti, said that a person going to an astrologer should pray day and night before applying to the astrologer for an answer. You get the same type of ritual attitude in traditional Vedic astrology, that it is an act of approach where the person has to have a respectful state of mind, and the astrologer needs to be equally, absolutely committed to the nature of truth. And once you get that between the two parties, it is marvellous what can be shown. And then the astrology is found to work out of some mystery that none of us really know how or why the astrology is found to work.
Well, it's sort of like a formula of sorts, whereby you take two components, put them together with the hope that something arises. And when you say that the individual approaches the astrology reading, they really should do that with a sense of reverence. I mean, they have to do it with a sense of seriousness in order to get the response they want, because it really does involve the seeker as much as it involves those who have sought.
Yes, seek and you shall find.
Right,
There's
yeah.
a message there. And there's something extraordinary that I think many astrologers realise, is that astrology works best when it counts. When it matters to somebody, that's exactly the basis on which astrology is going to really sing and dance for you. When astrology is being looked at a little too objectively or a little too scientifically, and you try and make an experiment of it, then it doesn't actually matter in itself. You're doing it for some other reason. It's a one-to-one relationship that will never be repeated in time and space, as you speak with the astrologer then and there, and that's when these symbols come to life.
So it's very organic, very spontaneous, very much of a slice of time. But the information derived from that point in time can be useful, therefore, for going forward, rather, right?
Oh yes, because
it sets course.
It sets a course. It gives you a symbolic frame for casting your next steps in life and reorienting your life. So I'm very interested in the idea of astrology being a symbolic narrative that people can unbind previous failed narratives in their lives, and often many of the reductionist approaches to explaining why we're like we are just to bound us up. And astrology opens up that narrative, gives you other possibilities. It's always further metaphors, further possibilities, further stories. Astrology is so rich like that. And the person often will, hearing the astrologer speak, will slightly for themselves recompose the narrative, and they'll hear what they need to hear from the astrology and then make it their own.
Yeah, it's very interesting. But it does require a certain amount of motive on the person's, on the seeker's chart. The person who wants to have the reading. They have to be engaged in a way that they're looking for information, and they sort of seek you out as a font of information. And you may not know the information prior to the experience, but through the interchange and through the relationship of the time and the moment, that truth arises. And It's based on the chemistry of the two people, very much like just a magical sort of moment in time. I mean, it really is just that ding slice of time, right?
It's more than the sum of its parts.
Right, exactly.
Which is why the astrologer must be very careful not to imagine that it's simply out of their skill or their understanding that this has all come. It's come about from something a little beyond the astrologer, and that includes the other person.
Mm-hmm. But it's sort of like that mixture, because out of any two things you're going to get a third component, and the third component in this case would be the outcome of what is derived as a result of that mixture. Just like a marriage, you look at a marriage as a symbiotic kind of relationship where you've got an A component and a B component, and then what derives from that is actually a new entity.
Yes.
And so it's a similar kind of quality that you find when you're doing the astrology reading of the person, because at that moment in time, the seeker, or the person who seeks the astrology reading, may come to you with, they have a set of preconceived notions or a set of answers that they're seeking, and yet it's only through that interchange, that be here now sort of moment, in which they really come to that conclusion. And that is fairly magical in itself, would you not? Yeah.
Yes. So the moment of astrology idea is, as you use the phrase, a be here now approach to astrology. It's the astrologer doesn't need to look for all sorts of reasons and science as to why astrology might or might not work and what was happening at birth and things. It's what is shown to the astrologer now that really counts.
And yet, do you find that when that interchange happens, that conversation happens, do you find that people want to, just as a typical example, would they want to hear what you know about them from their past, or would they want your observations based on their charts? Would they want to know what you saw, or would you be forward-looking, or would you be backward-looking?
Well, I know from previous conversations with you, Chris, that we might have rather different styles, and there are a number of different styles of truly practicing astrology, and each practitioner will find their own best and true move, and it's not that any one is the right move or the wrong move. In my own approach, I do tend to want to have some context that I work from when I work with a client, so I'm more effective when I'm dealing with almost a problem-solving approach. The client says, I've got this particular problem, here are the details. Then I look at the astrology, see whether I understand that, how far it fits, and then I can make my move with the client on that basis. Mm-hmm. Whereas there are other approaches that will want not to be bound up with the context of the client too much, but to first give their understanding of the symbols that are shown to them and let the client respond to that. These are different approaches.
Yeah, I can see your point there. But when do you find that by knowing more about them prior to your consultation, does that taint your picture of them? Does that sort of preset your vision?
It will, but then I'll be guided by the symbolism as to whether that vision is true or not. So what will classically happen, and most astrologers I think know this very well, that a person will declare to you that they've got this, this and this interest and understanding of things that are happening to them, and you can see, well, it's this, this and that you haven't told me about. How about that? Mm-hmm. And you know to begin to ask, tease out, suggest things in relation to that they haven't spoken about. And that's one of the most mysterious things about the natal horoscope, is how it will reveal this unspoken area that's difficult for somebody to say.
Yeah, it's really a very spontaneous, sort of organic unfolding of ideas that take on a life of their own, literally, because of the fact of the mere interchange. When you have a conversation, or if you're in a brainstorming session, say, trying to solve a problem, and you bounce back and forth ideas with people, and that flow of energy creates something, all of a sudden, boom, there's this great moment of revelation and something comes out of it.
Yes.
That's sort of the same sort of dialogue that you're looking at.
Yes, it is, and that's led me to discriminate. I don't want to sound over-technical here, but I'm very interested in the problem of interpretation, that is hermeneutics in general, and astrologers' interpretation, and I'm very interested in distinguishing what I call realised from speculative interpretation. And what I mean by realised is that in the middle of general conceptual working out, this must mean this must mean that in a horoscope, the astrologer suddenly is gripped by the meaning of a symbol and sees it in another way. It's an odd little knowing, and every astrologer knows this, and you see it more truly. And if you speak to that, it's surprising how effective that can be. And so one can go a long way through a reading or attempting to interpret a horoscope and feel one is struggling with the symbolism, and you're trying this, trying that, seeing if it makes sense, and then you sort of hit something. And the curious thing is that can happen with the client, and the client can be hit by something and it comes back to you like a charge. You realise that you've actually said something key and the person is responding, and then the two of you connect in a quite different way, and symbolism literally comes to life at that moment.
And symbolism would be what we refer to as sort of the themes that are brought about by planets or by aspects or by typical astrological language, right?
Yes, absolutely. Often the jokes that a person has or a little mannerism that they have, you suddenly see this in exactly in the horoscope. It's somehow obvious when you see it. It's difficult at this point. I'm trying to think of examples, but you see it immediately. You say, oh, heavens, that's exactly that placing in the horoscope. Or you make a remark about it and the person says, yes, that's exactly right. So Maggie had a person who was, this is typical of how it works, who had Venus in Aries, Lord of the mid-heaven, and the person turned out to be a shepherdess. So Maggie talked about was trying to think of symbolism that would work here, and then the person says they're a shepherdess, and you think, oh, good heavens, ruler of the mid-heaven in Aries, being Venus, and the person goes, it's that concreteness of symbolism sometimes that's so extraordinary concrete, where a person has been having quite serious headaches and you didn't realise it, and it's a Saturn in Aries that's hitting them, and it isn't just generally about the head or Aries things, it's quite specific, and you suddenly feel for them as an astrologer. You feel, oh, that's Saturn in Aries, yes, the headache that they've been having, that's the Saturn in Aries. That's a highly concrete piece of symbolism drawn from the whole panoply of possible readings that we can have of any one of these placings that becomes real in the actual interpretation. And often the client will actually fill in the concrete details out of the generalities that the astrologer has given. The astrologer speaks in certain general symbolism, and the client makes it concrete. Says, yes, you're talking about this, aren't you? And then, of course, the client will think the astrologer exactly saw that. Well, the astrologer didn't. They were working off more general symbolism, but it's become true.
So the astrology, I always think of astrology as being theme-based, which is sort of that general area you're referring to. And yet the client provides the details, which gives the specificity to the imp of what they're trying to drill into. And that is that can only happen at moment in time. I think that and do you think that the person coming to you is indicated in the chart as well? I mean, is there a point in the chart that says they chose this moment to come to see me because it is obvious they need to see me? Is that evident?
If that needs to be seen, it's like you get the horoscope of the consultation. Some astrologers work very much with the chart for the moment of the consultation, and that can be interesting because sometimes it's very exact, other times it's not showing at all. All you can say is if you try to fix it as a complete rule, it'll get you nowhere.
Right.
But if you are on the lookout for when it wants to show, then it can show most amazingly. You'll see the exact contact of the moment of an exact transit now to factor in the client's chart, and you know that that's trying to tell you something, and you will definitely beaver around. You use all the words you can until the hit comes. So, but to make a complete rule of it would also be fictitious.
Limiting.
It's limiting.
Limiting.
A problem for our astrology in general is we often want to fix it to definite rules that are going to guide us every time. Well, it'll play with us if we try to do that.
I mean that's as unlikely as two people being the same. We can't have a hard fast rule of anything. And oftentimes I think that astrology and astrologers try to paint themselves into these boxes of a fixed sign or a mutable sign or a cardinal sign or whatever the aspects are that we see through sort of the traditional cookbook style astrology. But Yet, in that consultation, there is some validity, there is some truth in that, but it is limiting because it doesn't allow the humanistic character to enter into it, which has those rough edges, which has those, that very amorphous kind of area where we have humanity. And humans are different largely because of their experience and because of their time and place of birth. There's a combination of the two. But how a person fulfills their chart or lives out what they see as their sort of manifest destiny is a result of their responses to that. And that's an interesting segue into where we're going. I mean, do you see the natal chart do you see it as a map of a or an owner's manual, so to speak, for lack of a better word?
Right. I'm going to have to answer a bit indirectly here, Chris, because this touches this more philosophical dimension.
Right.
And I don't want to get too complicated about it, but I probably don't know if I said earlier, there are probably two levels to astrology here. That one is more magical in its understanding, and the other is the astrology we normally practice, which works perfectly well without having to have a clever philosophical or magical understanding. But at that more magical level, the analogy I want to use to introduce it would be the idea of the metaphoric mirror, that astrology is a mirror. And just as the mirror does not do a thing to the reality it mirrors, it absolutely is empty, it reflects back faithfully that which is. And it's important to see that whatever might be fate that governs human destiny, possibly the astrologers know very little of it and very little more than ordinary humanity. But we're given a remarkable gift. We're given a means by which something is shown to us of how that fate might be at work now. That's all that we're given. So rather than the mirror causing something at any point, the mirror is allowing certain things to be seen. But what can be seen is only a tiny fraction of what theoretically or by some Buddha mind could be seen. So we as astrologers are only ever seeing a little piece of the mirror anyway. And I'd want, from this slightly more magical understanding and philosophical understanding, want astrologers to realise that they don't have to project an idea that the whole of everybody's destiny was stamped out in that horoscope. Because even if it was, there is no astrologer who can ever see that, given that we only see a tiny glimpse of that mirror at the moment when it's needed to be seen, i.e. the moment of the reading. Given that, it's better to say we do not know whether we are or are not fated at birth, and the astrologer certainly doesn't know. There are strange things about human destiny. There appear to be fates that govern us in some way. The astrologer isn't the master of those, but the astrologer is given the privilege of a glimpse at what might be important at any moment.
Yeah, that's interesting. But do you not see a propensity or an affinity for a certain characteristic in the natal chart? Do you see, if you saw the chart of William Shakespeare or Gandhi or something like that, would you see an ability or a possibility or a potential for something? Or you see it in much different terms? Given our knowledge of symbolism, which is so tiny, we've already talked, Chris, about off record here about Vedic astrology and tropical Western astrology, and what happens when you have different systems of astrology. How can they all be true? Some astrologers work with countless asteroids. How can they be true? Hypotheticals. Now, the odd thing about symbolism is symbolism wishes to help humanity, or there's something about symbolism that's precious to us and is constantly there for us. So countless things will show through symbols, mysteriously. We don't know why. Now, that does mean that it's better to say that when we use our traditional symbols of Western astrology, we know that those symbols will continually reveal to us, rather than say, we're back to the two levels approach here. It is perfectly acceptable to say that given the natal horoscope you see a strong Saturn in a certain place, it might be in the 7th, you know that the test will be in relationships, I'll say that. Was the person destined to be so? All I can say is that when they come to me and I see that Saturn in the 7th, I know the true narrative that I should begin to develop with them is the problem of test of relationships that they will have encountered. And when I say that,
that can sound to somebody as if they were always fated to have that. All I can say is, remember this strangeness of the mirror. I do not know whether that is or is not so. All I know is what is now required for us is to look at your life of the client, within view the idea that you have this test in relationships, which will have shown many times in your life. You ask, is this true? It'll turn out to be true, very probably, because our astrology does work, it does show. But the fact that it shows to us does not mean we are next able to say, you were always bound to be like that, because it doesn't matter. Whether you were or won't does not matter. What matters is your attitude to relationships, given you see this pattern in your life now. That's why it's a be here now astrology.
Mm-hmm.
So the old arguments about fate and free will, they are very, very profound and important in one way, but they're of no great importance, provided the astrologer does not let their reading become a deterministic and fatalistic reading now, which is a deadly thing that can happen, and it's something I'm always very concerned with about astrology, that sort of sense of this was always bound to be so then floods over to become a determinism now about what you will and
also
do.
Sets the stage for what could be as well.
What could be, and limits you into a certain way of approach. Yes.
Yeah. And you don't want to limit someone. You want them to just be aware of their abilities at the moment, and then of course that does provide them with an ability to make a decision.
Yes, it does.
But they can go decide which road to take.
It's certainly, if they then see, I must have limited myself in relationships, this appears to be what is shown to me now, they then are in a position to begin to choose, how will I now modify myself so that I don't find myself in this trap again and again. So oddly, you will have fulfilled the requirement of an apparently deterministic astrology, you're always bound to be so, and yet not fallen into a trap of fate, because you're saying, this is a story we have to take up now about your life. Once again, we're talking about a mystery of how come symbols show both past, present and future, and the fact that symbolism shows both past, present and future immediately traps the mind into thinking this was always meant by some other fate to be so, but the fate is your responsibility now.
Mm-hmm. So as a result of this interchange, you put the onus back on the seeker.
Yes.
To fulfill or to manifest what they have come to understand through the course of the reading. They have to decide at that point how to implement.
They do indeed.
And that is probably. And how does that affect the client? Does the client feel as if they are guided in that way? Do they feel imbued with a certain enhanced knowledge, or is it just sort of another person's opinion, like how do I look today,
Well, in the exchange that occurs, that we've already suggested occurs between astrologer and client, there is a further piece to this magic, which is that the astrologer is actually standing there for the celestial mystery. The astrologer is a speaker of the cosmos. Now, whether the astrologer feels themselves capable or not of that is necessarily what happens as the astrologer works with the symbols of astrology and speaks them to the client. That means that what the astrologer says does carry this other deeper import, and it carries an import that comes from some other place that none of us are in command of and cannot control. And so you are a speaker of a celestial mystery as an astrologer. That means that the person coming to you will feel it's not just that they've been to a wise counsellor or that they've been to a shrink to get and that's good advice. It's that the astrologer is speaking from some other knowing. That's why the work of an astrologer has a sacred component to it. It's much closer to a religious calling than it is to simply a modern definition of a counselling calling.
So do you see the astrologer in that capacity as a medium or as an antenna or something like that? Who's the font?
Well,
the vessel?
Different astrologers take different views here. Not all will agree with putting it this way, but I would put it in the category of medium. The astrologer is medium at this point.
Okay. And they are sort of intuiting information based on their own knowledge of symbolism and how the symbols are adequate and appropriate at the time.
Yes, their imaginative perception becomes a vessel for this other intelligence that's at work between the two of them, from who knows where, which I do think is spiritual in its nature, and so that's why the astrologer doesn't own the information. It's not a piece of information the astrologer has. It's something that breaks forth between the two in the reading.
It certainly is a glimpse in time. There's no question about it. You're sort of taking like an old-fashioned record player. You're putting the needle down on a groove, and you're sort of getting a snap time that says this is where you are, and how you go forward with that is based on the outcome of that conversation. A very dynamic, very fluid, very spontaneous kind of revelation. Yes. And you do believe that revelation is a magical byproduct of the conversation between the two. It has to be twofold.
Yes, it is twofold. To use your analogy, actually, of the moment you put the stylus down on the groove, you actually at that moment get the whole LP. You actually get a sense of what the whole symphony must sound like. Even on that one moment, you've caught it.
Perfect.
And it's that connection with the whole cosmos and the meaning of things that is given in that moment. That's the magic for the client. They feel connected. They get a sense of the whole picture. It's immediately intuited, even if it can't be put fully in words.
Right. I think that is a very, very apt description of what it's like, because it's almost like getting a drop of elixir on your tongue or something like that. You have that moment of awakening and the aha moment people always refer to. Yeah. And I think that is an incredibly valuable point in time, which really elevates. I mean, I think most people don't view astrology in those terms. It's a very interesting take on astrology, because it really comes down to this real magical discussion, I think, which really elevates the conversation to a much higher level, but simply by virtue of types of information and the willingness of both parties to be engaged in this intuitive process.
Yes,
yeah,
yes,
great.
No,
that's
exactly,
great.
Yes.
My guest today is Geoffrey Cornelius. I'm speaking to him from his home in Canterbury, and we are discussing his new book, Moment of Astrology. We'll be back in about 3 minutes with the remainder of our conversation. Fascinating discovery. I encourage you to look him up on the web, and when I come back, I'm going to have information about classes he teaches and ways that you can contact him. So be sure to hang in there, and we'll be back in about 3 minutes. So be right with us. What is your destiny? Where are you going? What is your real purpose? Do you know? Do you want to know? Of course you do. It's your duty to yourself. We are all here for a reason, and we all have great potential. Discover all of this and more with a professional astrology reading. My name is Chris Flisher, and I can help you. Discover your strengths and work on your weaknesses, and live your life to its fullest capacity. Based on your birthday, birthplace, and birth time, an authentic astrology reading will allow you to live your life to the fullest and reveal your true purpose. Only real astrology can give you real information. It is your destiny, and it is your path. Write me at chris@chrisflisher.com and book a reading today, or call me at 978-393-1036. That's 978-393-1036. www.chrisflisher.com. Okay, we're back. My name is Chris Flisher. Welcome again to the second half of Turning of the Wheel. As you know, this is a great show about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. While I have your attention, I want to encourage you to sign up for my weekly newsletter, which you can get to from my website. In that newsletter, I have the weekly astrology for each of us, and as well as sort of a mundane glimpse of what's happening in the world each week. And so it's interesting for that perspective. I encourage you all to read your rising sign as well as your sun sign. I encourage you all to memorize your rising sign. I know you hear that a lot from me, and you're going to hear it a lot from me in the future, but that's one of my things that I'm here to do, so make sure you do that. Read the two together. When you read the two together, you'll get a much closer, more granular take on what's happening in the world. My guest today is Geoffrey Cornelius. He's the author of A Moment in Astrology, and it's an interesting title that we started our conversation off with simply because it talks about the concepts of, the astrology consultation being more of, rather than being just some sort of mechanistic kind of cookbook process, it's more a theosophical, metaphysical, divination kind of interchange between the astrologer and the client, to the point where great truth is revealed that can only happen at that moment in time. And is truly a magical sort of experience, I think. And when people come back to you, say if people come to you for a reading, what would they expect? And if they would come to you on a second reading, would you expect different information? And sort of that spontaneity would have to be different, I would think.
Yes, although you build up a certain path with the client, you build up a certain narrative with the client, and it's that becomes enriched each time. But nevertheless, something new will always come up. I should explain that I've tried to be a consultant astrologer at several occasions in my life, and I'm more or less successful. But then I did finally settle some years ago and realised that my best work was guiding people who themselves were exploring symbolism and astrology. So I'm more effective then as a teacher. I've always loved teaching practical astrology classes and turning people on to symbolism in general. But I'm then particularly interested in investigating, being a supervisor for others doing consultancy work for other people, and several astrologers have taken me up on that. And so what I do is normally have several sessions with a person, or I'll work with somebody who is a symbolist. So I've worked with a writer who's quite a symbolist, who's interested in astrology but interested in exploring symbolism with me. So that's probably where I'm more effective. And that relates to my general interest in divination.
So you sound like you're sort of an astrologer's astrologer.
Yes, in that way I am, and a lot of my work, as with my book, Moment of Astrology, is more concerned with addressing the astrology community and serious practitioners and asking them questions that it is in presenting to the public. Having said that, I've always loved doing basic astrology classes, and I don't come over all high and theoretical and philosophical when I do that.
Well, but astrology sort of lends itself to that kind of conversation anyway, and I think that by holding that bar, you're sort of imbuing the astrological community with a sense of seriousness, a sense of purpose, and a proper context. I think that the context of astrology is important, and I think it's gotten lost over the years because people tend to run to websites and stuff like that and look up things about astrology. Then they sort of come to their own conclusions, but without the guided hand of a knowledgeable person, they really don't reach that point. And that brings me back to the idea of the symbol. When you speak of symbolism, to me a symbol is an archetype of some sort that represents a significant point of life or a quality of life or a characteristic of a person's personality or some such thing. And I'm curious if you could elaborate on what your definition of a symbol is. Am I on the mark there, or am I astray?
Yes. No, you're not astray at all. You're not astray at all. Well, I accept what you say about symbol. First of all, it's very difficult to pin down what is meant by symbol, and there are many, many understandings of it. I take a broadly Jungian approach to symbol, that it's a mode by which that which cannot be otherwise conceptualized will be revealed to us. So the concepts by which we interpret symbols, and even the concrete interpretations we make, are always much less than the symbol itself, and the symbol's a necessary means to give us that other knowing. So we're not talking about ordinary knowledge and ordinary information as modern culture tends to understand it. We're talking about symbolic or spiritual information. Now, there's a very important issue here that I do want to raise, and that's that I came into astrology from a great interest in divination. So my great love is divination and omen watching and omen reading, and so I've always naturally taken astrology as part of that. So that leads to a slightly different take on the symbol, let's put it that way, where it's not that there's any one way of taking symbols, but as to treat symbols as omens, i.e. as showings, omina, that which shows. And they have to, although you can think that a horoscope is there on the table in front of you, it's lying there, it always has those meanings because those symbols are on it. Well, no, it's an astronomical diagram until the moment that its symbols are interpreted. So the act of interpreting a symbol lifts it from being an astronomical piece of data to into this other realm of knowing, which we call astrology. And that's once again back to the theme of Moment of Astrology. And that, to my mind, is where astrology is really, in principle, very close to divination. It is a form of divination, a very a very particular and unusual and marvellous form of divination. But there's a great difference, really, in practicing astrologers who have had a good experience with other divinatory forms and practicing astrologers who've only ever come in through astrology, which many have. And sometimes those who've only come in through astrology, they've encountered symbol through astrology, can still get stuck with what I would regard as an over-deterministic view of the symbols being part of a code that's of energies that are being unfolded at certain moments of time and not necessarily causing things but impinging upon us, and that's fixed by the ephemeris in moments of time, instead of seeing astrology as a mode by which symbols can be presented to us. It's the most powerful mode by which symbolism is presented to us. And one of its marvels, compared with other forms of divination, is that astrology is a symbol form in time. It uses time as one of its fields of expression. Very few forms of divination actually have that power of using time as their field. But that gives astrology an immense power as a symbol form.
Yeah, I would certainly think that that single aspect of time itself, which is completely relevant to every human being and every entity on the face of the planet, is remarkable because of the fact that we are a continuum. We are moving. We are constantly in motion, and as a result of being constantly in motion, nothing is ever static. And to ignore that is really not to live. I mean, if you think about it, we have to embrace that sense of time, because the second that just passed will never be here again, and yet it contains all of history in it, because all of history is a continuous evolutionary mass of events and structures and people and everything else. That concept by itself is remarkably unique to astrology, as you mentioned, and yet the symbols that you talk about have a certain permanence to them, because the symbol as a symbol has to be something that you can recognize and reflect on. And how that symbol appears in time is really the conversation, correct?
Because astrology is a divination of time, it means that the timed event of birth gives an enduring symbol which will have a status ritually and metaphorically for you that outstrips any other passing symbol of the transits of the time. You return to this symbol given to you at birth, the symbol of the horoscope. So that is a great mystery. All I really ask is that astrologers remember their history, remember that what divides them actually from most spiritually minded people, what always divided them from the Christians, was the assumption that there's a determination given at birth that in any way determines the soul. Christianity always fought that definition of astrology, and astrologers tried to get out of it in certain ways. But in fact, as probably might have picked up in what I said, I regard that really as a bit of a non-problem. We shouldn't get stuck on it as astrologers. Whether our fates are or are not determined for us unknown by God is a mystery beyond our telling and beyond the astrologer's telling. But once again, we are privileged to connect up moments in our own time, our own histories, our own narratives, through the recurring cycles of the planet, with the natal horoscope as its most powerful omen or showing given to us. That is a marvellous thing. It doesn't mean we're fated by that horoscope. It means we're given a superb mirror by that superb mirror. It's as bright as any mirror can be bright.
Do you think that mirror is accurate?
The accuracy depends on the angle at which you're looking in the mirror, because the mirror becomes clouded, as the Buddhists say. One has a dusty mirror, and then one doesn't see well. The mirror simply needs to be polished.
And that polishing has to happen regularly.
That polishing, as we pay attention to the symbols, it happens regularly. But the other thing too, that it's not a simple mirror. It's a mirror with many shutters and parts. It's like mothers of pearl laid over it, a prism. Yeah. And sometimes it turns, that prism. It's like Indira's net or something. It turns, and we'll only see one aspect, one of the number of the faces of that prism. So we're never. Who could see the whole prism in all its turns?
So you could argue that every day that prism, every minute that prism looks different.
That prism looks different. It's turning, and we're seeing it differently with each moment of interpretation as well.
Yeah, I've often used that myself. I think of life of looking at, even if it's a stagnant or a static moment you're looking at, just by turning that prism 1 degree, one direction, you change your perspective of that static moment. So that is very relevant to me, I think, especially with regard to time and how it moves forward and how we assimilate our place in that time as well as our influence on the symbol of that time and how we manifest those together. It's really a magical stew that is constantly a recipe that's constantly in flux.
Yes.
I mean, it's a organic, like a Helios. It's always turning but moving forward at the same time.
Absolutely.
And yet that is a very complex one from which we can never return.
And oddly, whether it's by some aspect of our higher mind, our soul that guides us in this, we're only ever shown what we need to be shown of the prism. That's the marvellous thing. It's very humane to us. It doesn't try to present us with the whole thing all at once.
And yet people get frustrated by that. This sort of like, if I knew then what I know now, things would have been different.
Yes, well, we're always seeking a position where we could imagine we could have controlled things or we can control things in the future. Yes, well, this is the truth of human life. If only I hadn't been so stupid. Now I know what I know.
Well, hindsight's 20/20.
We're changing. We change the interpretation of our own natal map. We see it more deeply. We say, now I understand better why that placing is as it is in my natal horoscope or this person's horoscope, and we think, I've understood it better. But what is happening is we're seeing again, we're re-narrating, we're casting narrative differently as that prism turns once again.
Mm-hmm. Do you think all people are, and this is going to sound a little bit odd, do you think people are all created equal with regard to their potential? I mean, we have looked at charts of people who have been very difficult, Adolf Hitler, Charles Manson, people like that. Then we look at someone like Abraham Lincoln or Gandhi. When we look at these charts, would we think that we all started out with a similar potential and we just went awry? Or
well, remember from the analogy, we're given, when we're seeing another person's horoscope, and that person might be a historical character, not a client, it's going to be a different alchemy when it's not a client, it's not a person we look objectively. We're being shown little parts of a mirror for us to look at, and they're our constructions of what we think Charles Manson or Hitler or Stalin was and what they mean. And part of that will be what we are being shown to understand now. It's very curious. If we were to be so naive as to imagine that we can therefore see the truth of that person, that is a step I don't think any astrologer has in their power, or any human being has in their power, because we can only say what is shown to us and what we feel we must understand of that person. We're not the ones to account give the final arbitration there. So from that point of view, we must respect all showings and souls all souls of other human beings as equal to us and as being a great mystery of which we're shown tiny, tiny little points of light in our astrology.
Well, I mean, look, with using that same example, if we were to hypothetically glimpse back in time, had one of those people who turned out to be evil, had they been in consult with an astrologer at that moment in time, could they have altered their path?
Here, you see, what happens is we come up with some amazing, not so hypothetical cases that are a total paradox, and the astrologer won't know how to deal with it. I'll give you an example. I used to use it in teaching classes, and not too often, and I thought, no, this is a bad chart to use. The horoscope of Charles Manson as an example. I do know from the placings in that chart, which have considerable afflictions, Taurus rising, with a Venus-Sun conjunction in Scorpio on Serpentis in the 7th, and other very powerful placings. I do know as a very fatalistic astrologer of a medieval bent of mind probably would have said, this is an evil person. The odd thing about this is, there is this, Charles Manson then emerges culturally as this emblem of an evil person, and so too his horoscope emerges as an emblem of an evil person. If you wanted to use medieval techniques, you would pick it up. The odd thing about how odd that is, I do know that in many other cases it would not be so. The person doesn't emerge, the horoscope doesn't emerge as an emblem in that way. So why it is that certain historical horoscopes come forward and become emblematic in this way is itself a great curiosity. But that isn't a proof one way or the other of deterministic astrology. It's a proof of the crazy way symbols work. So I'll invite anybody who wants to look at Manson's horoscope, they'll see this extraordinary phenomenon. It might induce the fatalistically minded astrologer think that he was fated to be like that. I disagree. Manson committed the acts he committed. He is a free soul. It is up to him and down to him. He's then presented in our culture in a certain way, and the scintillation of symbolism presents him to us in this way. It doesn't mean anything was ever fated to be.
But do you think that the potential for this person existed, and therefore could that potential have been directed differently?
Quite well. You see, there are possibilities. Things occur in the realm of mind to do with clairvoyant and prophetic gifts, and sometimes these intersect with astrology, and you cannot tell how come it is that the astrologer might hit upon something quite prophetically that makes you think that is unerring fate at work. But realistically and practically, pragmatically, in one's ordinary practice of astrology, it is so that people have the complete power to alter that potential, and any move towards a deterministic "it had to be this way" is a wrong and unhealthy move. So even though this is this odd paradox, there may indeed be fates and destinies, none of us are privileged to really explore that. This is given to clairvoyants and mediums occasionally. Sometimes that cuts through into the astrology. We do not know why. But practically, and in the true sense of the ordinary work with clients and virtually all work I've ever done, it remains the broadly humanistic move in astrology, the free will move in astrology is true, that we have the complete ability and demand upon us to work with what we seem to be shown, not to regard ourselves as bound by it, and we do have that potential. And I'm in that sense a free will astrologer.
Right, and you think about using that same analogy and just stringing it along a little further for the sake of discussion. Had he been under the influence or been influenced by a different type of just under a different influence at the time, he could very well have manifested into something else. Equally powerful. And I think that's part of the paradox of the astrology. Whenever you look at a astrology of a famous person, you may see a great deal of potential, and you don't always necessarily know if it's potentially good or potentially bad. The potential seems to exist based on the characteristics of the chart, and yet how those are manifested may be determined by the free will of the individual and the time and place.
Practical cases are the best for astrologers to work from. If you look at the horoscope of Mahatma Gandhi, it's a violently conflicted, it's a very difficult horoscope indeed. He's a very tough man, and he's very tough on the people around him, so the toughness remains. But there's no way that the astrologer is permitted to predict off a violently tough horoscope unless some other intersection of knowing enters for whatever reason we cannot know. But broadly speaking, when it comes to natal astrology, we are not in the position to talk at all deterministically. It does mean that violent horoscope configurations must be talked towards their better outcome and more healing outcome. That's a practical demand upon the natal astrologer, and I think that's one of the lessons really that 20th century astrology and humanistic astrology has really taught us, and I admire that move. And it does shake off the clutches of a fatalistic tendency that has always clung to astrology. So there is the odd capacity for, on occasions, remarkable concrete prediction is given to astrologers under certain circumstances, but those are unique circumstances where this occurs, and that does not mean that we are predetermined. That's odd. So this is a mystery and a paradox. But so an astrologer does sometimes with a client, this is something that's well worth a lot of discussion, sometimes with a client is asking a very concrete question about things. It might be business. And you can see by the way they're talking that they might sound unrealistic. You can definitely see that in the astrology. You can then time and when you see that there might be something going to fail, and you can probably predict a business failure, etc. What does that mean? And you can even offer that to the client. You say, if you do this, I think that business project will fail. Now, what does that mean, that type of concrete astrology? It's highly specific to the alchemy of that person at that time with you, who's come to you with that. It doesn't mean that that was always bound to be so. All you can say is, that's what's shown now, and I can be concrete about it. But the astronomer must be very wary, only to be concrete about what is truly shown to them to be concrete about, and that's fitting, and it is ethical to the situation. But beyond that, the fact that we can occasionally be concrete in that way in no way means that we live in a deterministic universe astrologically.
Right, but I'm wondering, supposing if you were to have met someone such as Charles Manson or Gandhi at a very young age, would you, as an astrologer, knowing this of them, knowing that they had a potential, a propensity, would you have been able, well, this is an arbitrary question, I understand that, but, theoretically, let's say, could you have guided them differently? I mean, potential is there.
Yes,
we see potential. We know even some of the most difficult charts. Typically, we see all people who've become somebody in their lives have difficult charts, simply because it's the squares and the difficult angles that propel them forward, that motivate them in ways that other people may not have. And we also see the inverse of that. People's charts that are fairly, boring in some ways. Am I going off?
Hypotheticals are a real killer here. I know. They're a real killer, because what if this?
I know,
yes.
I know.
What can I say? Given a very afflicted horoscope, in a technical sense, where you look at, you say, there are lots of things here that are going to lead to tough type of interpretations rather than easy interpretations, because it is full of squares and traditionally difficult placings, etc. Gandhi or Manson would be the case in point. Now, who knows, but that even with Manson, who's a total, what can one say, clearly destined on his own project in a way that's possibly unshakable, who knows? But who knows what would have happened had Manson seen a reasonably decent humanistic astrologer at a key time when he was in San Francisco, who'd named that Pluto on the IC and just said, look, your home background seems so destroyed, your mother was a prostitute and everything, is that sort of really bugging you, Charlie, Who knows whether that little revelation, that little scintilla of light, might just have lifted or altered the narrative so that he connected the fact of his mother with the family, the black painted bus and the family he next creates. With every astrologer moving backwards into the symbolism afterwards and see, you cannot, I would say, one does not know the limits of the possibility of a little symbolic showing being spoken at a certain moment to recontextualize the narrative. Who knows? Possibly not, and I'm being a total sentimentalist to say that, but I'd say give it a shot, and astrology has the power to open the narrative in a quite magical way you could not have expected, with consequences of unknown proportion.
It's very dualistic in that regard, and I think of it like I think of him as a good example, sort of, and as you mentioned, he's sort of like on a tightrope, and which way he falls on that tightrope or on that line that he's walking determines his output. He may have been equally as famous in other ways had he done something different, because he had the potential for greatness. Because it is out of conflict we get a crisis delivers creativity, I think, in some ways. How that's manifested is probably determined by the fate of the person and how they are, time and place. And of course, we have to take into account the time and place that he was living and what he endured, and the introduction of drugs and any number of things, variables that are were influenced at his time, which I'm sure tainted it. But it is an interesting discussion, because we think of someone that powerful of a character, what they could have done had they gone a different direction, what Hitler could have done had he gone a different direction. It's remarkable, and that's sort of getting back to the ability of the potential of the chart and the time and place. But maybe he did see an astrologer. Maybe he did. Charles Manson did see an astrologer. That who knows? I doubt that they would have told him to do that. But it is an interesting, and it's all conjecture, I understand, but it's a fascinating thing, because we're talking about time and fate and consequence, and because time is such such a movable stream, we can only surmise what would happen had things been different.
All I'm stating philosophically is I'd like astrologers to see there's a possibility of both exact, occasional, concrete prediction and statement of an exact nature in astrology, not necessarily predictive, but about the situation now, but it could be predictive, together with a complete responsibility and freedom of the human soul to find its way, and the two aren't incompatible at all, and that is my position. I think a problem arose for the humanistic astrologers, and it's where I suppose I take a different position to Rudyard, who I greatly admire. Rudyard felt that you had to abandon concrete symbolism in general, because concrete symbolism always tends to lead to a deterministic view, so he went for a much more generality of interpretation, I would say, when he was quite capable of concrete interpretation, and I think that's not necessarily so. You have both, but the astrologer must not be deluded about their powers in this, and there's a strict limit about what they can and should do.
Because you're right. I mean, they do have a certain power, and if they were to take that more concrete view, they could actually sway someone to be the wrong way. So that, as a teacher, as an instructor, what would you impart to people who were in this role of astrology? What would the advice be if you had to summarize it for being a consulting astrologer?
To be a consultant, yes. I really think that the modern consultant astrologer does need to know a bit, at least, of the history of their astrology, and they need to know about the movement of astrology through the 20th century. That they do need to have thought about the different schools of thought there are, because those schools, all of which have their successful understandings and their weak points, that is true of all of us, but they'll give that breadth of understanding philosophically that enables the astrologer to talk with many people. So I think a modern consultant astrologer should have some understanding of psychology, but that doesn't mean I think they need to be psychologically trained. So I don't think that's a necessity. And they should also have an understanding of how astrologers move from a quite deterministic revival in the 19th century, which was quite fatalistic and tried to be scientific, through to the modern astrology of Alan Leo, then to the humanistic movement. And they should have that, and I want them to have read into that without following slavishly all the points of it, and that will give them a very good basis. So in terms of, and then I think there is an ethic of consultancy that the astrologer needs to understand, that they'll learn from all of the healing arts. But of course, astrology is quite unique. It isn't like any of the other forms, so we must be faithful to our own practice in a way. So we can't simply adopt. We're not counsellors. We're a bit more than counsellors. We're doing something different. We need counselling skill, but we aren't counsellors.
Right, and it's a difficult line to walk. I think it's one that people often don't quite understand sometimes the skill required, because it does require empathy. It does require a certain amount of intuition. It requires a breadth of knowledge and an understanding of the human condition and how valuable their input can be. And it is difficult because it isn't recognized by the scientific community as a viable science, and yet we know, you and I both know, how valid and accurate it can be and how marvelous it can be. So it's really been maligned in some ways, and yet other people who understand astrology and who come to astrologers understand that, and they're the ones that have already opened the door. So they start the conversation by approaching you, and once they do that, you've already got a filter in place that says, yes, we know this person is willing to work with us. So I guess that's our best guide.
Yes, that's right.
Our best guide. And
we look in the wrong direction. The problem with astrology's lack of professional status is both a curse and a blessing, and the blessing of it is that we are free, in fact, to follow our own path without the say-so of all sorts of other people who don't understand what we do. I think we're in error as a community when we keep looking to quite hard definitions of science, as if that's ever going to back us up. Because the people who are our natural allies are the poets and the artists and the musicians. These are the people who understand what we do, and that it's in that area that our truth lies. Symbol and metaphor, literature, these things.
Yeah, sort of amorphous science.
Amorphous, and not trying to lay claim to empirical science, because it's not true. We're storytellers, you see. We're storytellers.
I think that's very accurate. Yeah. Why don't you give out your website, Geoffrey? I've been talking with Geoffrey Cornelius today. His book is called The Moment of Astrology. It's fully revised and updated, and it's subtitled "The Origins of Divination," which is a fascinating read for anybody who is an astrologer, number one, and anybody interested in this sort of esoteric science of astrology and the fascinating value that it provides to the world as well as to the individual seeking astrology. Geoffrey, what is your website and some of the things?
It's right. Anybody really interested in such obscure studies, we run an MA program in myth, cosmology and the sacred at Canterbury Christ Church University. That's a big ask for people from the States, but a wealthy American could do it over for a year.
And be much wealthier for it.
Well, and there's a website, www.astrodivination.com, all one word, astrodivination. So you'll find me up on that site.
And your readings are there, and people can contact you.
They can contact me through that site.
And I encourage you to do so, because I think you'd find that the magic that we've been talking about really is it's a glimpse in time, a moment in time, a slice in time when you come prepared with the full foreknowledge of yourself and what you want, and then the astrologer, Geoffrey in this case, is the person that provides you with the insight. And in that magical moment of time, the sort of the symbiotic relationship of time and place and knowledge formulates you with an amazing glimpse of your potential, where you can go and what you are to become. So it's been a great pleasure to speak with you today, and
thank you, Chris.
Yeah, very good, very kind of you to take the time out to speak to me in your busy schedule. It's not an easy task being an astrologer, and we have a heavy cross to bear, but we do it willingly. So keep us in mind, and thank you very much for calling. Good.
You've been listening to Turning of the Wheel with your host, Chris Flisher. To schedule a reading with me or to order artwork, you may visit my website at www.chrisflisher.com. That's www.chrisflisher.com, or email me, and you can call me at 978-393-1036. That's 978-393-1036. Thank you, and as always, be open to possibilities.